This is an institute for molecular science and engineering. It's one of a kind in Imperial College London for taking up big challenge around the world like this WaSH topic. And we want to break down all of the disciplines with all the faculty, and then we try to understand each other and then where we come from and make it a good solution for it. Most important thing is we may come up with a good solutions and we can cooperations. Okay, I think that's all for today for short introductions. And without further ado, I would like to have speaker today, three speakers. I will invite the first speakers. Today I'm not going to introduce any people because it's going to save me a lot of time. So I'm in trouble. So I'll let Alex introduce first.
Thank you for the introduction. Good day, everyone. My name is Alex. I'm a research assistant at Imperial College London, but I've recently finished up my PhD at King's College London, so a bit of the work I present today will be from that. That's the logo. So today I'm part of, I'm part of the Environmental Research Group. We're based at a white city at Imperial College London, and we are mainly focused on contaminants in the environment, particularly in water. So that'll be sort of the focus of my talk today. And this will be using a miniaturized passive sampling device to sort of scale up the passive sampling process that we can use to monitor for water contaminants in water and in biota. So contaminants in the environment can come from a variety of sources, mainly from humans. So wastewater, excellent. So pharmaceuticals, personal care products, industrial products from the cities and towns we live in, or pesticides from the environment. I just want to make a point here that when I say contaminants, chemical contaminants, not all chemicals are bad in the environment. It's just that we don't know which ones are actually going to be causing damage or not. So that's part of our work as well. So, for example, with pharmaceuticals, feeling a bit under the weather this morning, you take something to help you perk you up, and that ends up in this wastewater treatment plant where mainly the solids and the microbes are removed. And then that water, once treated, is discharged into the receiving waters of your local rivers and streams. And then you could also get interference from your pesticides, from diffusion as they spray across your land, or a runoff from rain events. And this also ends up in our receiving waters. Well, what is of concern is that we're talking about chemicals here. And chemicals, particularly pharmaceuticals, are designed to accumulate in an organism. So we need to know what the effect is on the local environment and also on the little critters that will potentially accumulate these compounds, and these can transfer up the food chain and potentially into humans as a One Health approach. Just to note as well, when there's discharge from the wastewater treatment plants, this is just normal discharge I'm talking about here, so it's the treated effluent that just flows out regularly. But then we also have the CSO events, which I'm sure most people have heard about in the news. And just for some numbers for you, in 2021, there were 350,000 discharge events in England and Wales, and the amount of time that was discharged roughly equates to 30 decades worth of discharge within a single calendar year. So it just gives you an idea of the scale of the problem we're dealing with. So passive sampling is one potential way we can measure contaminants in the environment, and this is based on the free flow of analytes from an environment to receiving phase along a diffusion gradient. And what's quite nifty about these compared to a grab sample where you just walk up, throw your bucket into a river and pull up whatever's there, is they estimate the time-weighted average concentration of contaminants in situ. Because uptake onto a passive sampler follows this mathematical equation here, and you can model the different regions using these equations here. What's also handy is because they are basically living in the same environment as these animals, they can be used to potentially as a surrogate to determine the amount of contaminants that their organism is exposed to, and also potentially be used as a surrogate in the fact that we can replace an animal for a passive sampler. But doing that is slightly difficult because an animal is very much alive and a passive sampler most definitely is not. So an animal can be modeled using a multi-component model where you've got excretion, metabolism, age, molt cycle, sex. All those factors play into the amount of contaminants that are absorbed by that animal. Whereas the passive sampler is just a single compartment model used with that max there. So this is where machine learning potentially comes into the project, where we can use that to bridge that gap between a one compartment model and a multi-compartment model. So passive samplers come in a variety of shapes and sizes and sorbent chemistries depending on what you want to look for. And most of them are roughly the size of your palm. Now there are some challenges with them. Primarily, you're limited to the size of the housing or the sorbent device, so you're basically limited to these sizes here. You can only contain one sorbent chemistry within each device. So what I mean by that is one chemistry that's specific to metals, to anions, to cations, to different molecular chemicals with different molecular properties. When you purchase a new housing, it takes a while for them to come in. And the biggest one is cost and solvent waste. So for example, the chem catcher here, one of those is a PTFE body. One of those sets you back about 50, 60 quid. And to elute one of these, so to use it as a pass sampler and use the organic extraction to get all the compounds of it, that's 40 milliliters of methanol you're using. So if you're doing a large-scale monitoring program with 10 devices with 40 milliliters of methanol, that becomes a rather large cost. And from a green chemistry and environmental sustainability perspective, not excellent. So part of my PhD was designing, so part of the solutions to this, my PhD was involved in designing a 3D printed passive sampler where it had to be small, easy to assemble, and can hold water solvents. And after quite a bit of tinkering in some CAD software, this is what I came up with. So this is what we have here. It's a miniaturized device that can hold 5 and 9 millimeter solvents separately from one another, and you can multiplex it with different solvent chemistries within the same device. These devices are very easy to deploy. For example, here, this is actually a baking cooling rack that I cable tied them to and drop them into the Thames. And overall, you can see it's very small. It's the size of 50-cent Aussie coin, or for the UK, it's just slightly larger than a UK 2 pence coin. Overall, the total cost of the device to 3D print is less than £2.50. So this has sort of solved our scalability side. Next question when it comes to passive sampling is, it's all well and good, but we need to calculate the time-weighted average concentration. We need to know the rate of uptake of chemicals onto the device, because each chemical functions slightly differently. So this is what this study was doing here. So basically, as with most science, you MacGyver something together. So this is a 5-litre beaker with which I was able to do this exposure with it. And every day I would remove one of these devices and extract off 3 of the replicates. And the water was also replaced, but the water was spiked with contaminants or emerging concern that we monitor for. And here are the uptakes of the different solvents, the HLV, anion, cation phases. And you can see the uptake is fairly linear over the 12 days of study, but it sort of falls off at the end there. So therefore, for this device, we decided to deploy them only for 7 days. So putting it into a freshwater application, this is the River Wandle in the southwest of London, and nearby you have the Beirns wastewater treatment plant. And for this work, first we have to know, the most important thing is where to take your sample. So this is where we did a little transect study of the stem of the Wandle based on some previous work, just taking grab samples as we moved along the river. So A is the closest to the Thames and S is closest to the source. And you can see from this graph, not only the jump in cumulative concentrations at site F, but also the bringing in of pesticides, or pharmaceutical products and drug metabolite. We found that F was the outfall, the location outfall of the Beirns wastewater treatment plant. Therefore, for this study, we chose site A, which is about 2 k's downstream, so we get good dilution, a good mixing from that input source. So for this study, it was a 6-month study, so every month for 6 months, indeed, I would go out and I would deploy these devices, 1 of each phase. At the same time, we would also collect water samples, and these little critters here called Gammarus pulex. And Gammarus pulex is an amphipod freshwater shrimp that is benthic detritivore, and these are basically an excellent indicator of river health. If you ain't got these in your river, something is wrong with your river. For the analysis, we use a targeted LC-MS method, which can rapidly separate 200 compounds within 4 minutes on a guard column, which is about 5 millimeters long. But despite the speed of this method, it's still extremely sensitive. So you can see that our limit of detection, so that's the lowest we can actually detect a sample on our instrument, is 0.01 nanograms per disc on the HLV disc, and then the Gammarus pulex we're at 1.5 nanogram per gram. So still an extremely sensitive instrument, says suitable for this application. Just some overview of the results. In total, there was 89 unique compounds found across all those phases, with 14 of them common to all the phases. And these are groupings here. The majority of them are pharmaceuticals and personal care products. Some of them are on the European Water Framework Directive watch list. And one of them on more known is pesticide imidacloprid, which is a neonicotide that was banned from agricultural use in the UK about 10 years ago. But now we are seeing it in the urban river system. And we believe that this is actually a result of veterinary medication. So fleas, ticks on your dogs and on your companion animals. On the passive sampler side, between the 2 phases, there were 16 common to all 3 phases. But you can see there are unique compounds for anion, cation, HLB phase, which basically means by multiplexing one device with multiple phases, we can increase the chemical space we sample used within the same device. So this is what we call the time-weighted average concentration. So this is the graph is showing you the concentration measured directly in water, and then the concentrations in water are extrapolated from the HLB anion cation discs using the RS study that was what I did before. And for something that was done in a 5-litre beaker in a lab, you can see we're not perfect, but we're pretty much within the same order of magnitude, which is very encouraging and also shows the passive sampler is reflective of the concentrations in the environment. We can also do something called risk quotients. So this is basically hazard assessment on how likely is a contaminant to cause damage to an animal. And we do this by dividing the measured environmental concentration by predicted no effect concentration, which is usually based on the effect value, EC50 or LC50. Basically, does it cause an effect in 50% of the population animal, or does it cause lethality in 50% of the population? And as you can see from these graphs here, imidacloprid again is quite high across the HLB, anion, cation, HLB, and water phases, but also we have diclofenac, which is listed on the European watch list, azithromycin, sulfapyridine, clarithromycin, and carbamazepine, and venlafaxine, which is also recently been listed on the watch list as well. We can also determine risk in the animal itself using something quite different, using toxic and effect units. And the toxic units are specific to pesticide, and unfortunately you can see in this river, all pesticides that we could find were above that -3 threshold in the animal, so likely to cause an effect in the animal. On the pharmaceutical side, we have to use the predicted critical concentration in the environment because we don't have enough EC50 values. But there's no definite threshold of what is good and what is bad, but generally citalopram and clopidogrel are quite high on there as well. So those are ones we need to look out for going into future studies. So for whole point of this, we're trying to map to the animal. And this PCA plot from here, you can see that we have the water data out here, the gammas up here, and the passive samplers over here. The passive samplers all overlap, but that is not surprising based on the chemistry of the solvents itself. But what is interesting is you can see that 33% of the variance is explained by the by the gammas and the passive sampler as opposed to water, which indicates that passive samplers are closer to the animal than the water data is. And most of the studies in our field will only measure the water, not the animal, when they try to do biometric studies. So after a bit of tinkering with some data, we found that we could actually map the toxic effect units on a passive sampler to the toxic effects used in the gammas using a simple linear equation. And basically from these equations here, it is potential to back maths to the concentration in the animal based on these equations here by just simply, once we can predict the toxic effect you get in the animal, we simply rearrange these equations down here to give us the concentration in the animal. And here's some examples of that at work. So we got a bit of variety in this. This is a simple linear regression model with only up to, I think it's n equals 50 is the highest point. So still relatively preliminary data, but you can see we get a range. So citalopram, we're off by 66 nanograms per gram. Imidacloprid, we're still within the error of the model, so pretty close with 28 nanogram per gram. But nortriptyline, we're pretty much bang on. So this sort of gives us an idea of what contaminants we need to look out for in the animal and if they potentially be causing an effect. So in conclusions, the work I showed today demonstrates a way to miniaturize multiplexer scale-up passive sampling process for monitoring contaminants of concern in freshwater. We can determine uptake rates for 78 compounds. There were 89 unique CCs determined across all matrices, with imidacloprid as high risk, probably due to the parasiticides. And using toxic and effect units, it is possible to predict the CEC concentration in the gammas Coolx based on the 3D passive sampling data. And this work overall demonstrates a rapid estimation and prioritization of chemical pollutants and risk to environments to organisms in situ. Well, also we're not particularly, going out and harvesting hundreds of these little guys for our studies. So we're playing into that 3 R's of animal replacement, reduction. I can't remember what the third R is, but there's a third R, believe me. Anyway, in conclusion, I'd just like to thank everyone involved. So my PIs, Leon and Steven Schwarzenbaum and Dan Cowan helped this PhD project happen, my lab group, and also all my other collaborators without whom much of this work would have been possible. Thank you for your time, everyone.
have a second speaker, Tiana.
Okay, right. Morning. Is it still morning? Yes. Morning, everyone. My name is Emma Beirns. I'm a PhD student here at Imperial in the EWRE section. And rather than I think the other two speakers are going to be presenting lots of lovely results and the conclusions that they've reached, I'm rather going to be presenting a question. So my talk is titled Ammonium Transformation to Nitrogen Gas in Anaerobic Wastewater Treatment and Unnoticed Microbial Pathway. And I hope by the end you'll agree with me that we've got some very interesting results that merit further investigation. So to set the scene, we are using a technology called anaerobic fluidized bed bioreactors. Ordinarily, there is a second stage to these reactors that contains membranes. However, for our purposes, we decided we weren't so interested in the physical removal as much as the microbial processing. So upstairs in the Roger Perry lab over in the civil engineering building, we've got two bench scale AFBRs that we've been continuously operating for 298 days now. So they're going pretty strong, they're healthy. I've included a few details here which are more of a sanity check and I'm hoping will answer some questions. So we've got positive pressure passively maintained, which means if there are any gas leaks, it will be the biogas leaking out rather than atmospheric air leaking in. And additionally, we're using water seals on the effluent and the gas collection lines to ensure that, again, there are no leaks. The reactor columns themselves, so these like long bits here, they are made of a clear acrylic so that we can monitor the fluidized beads that are inside. So in order to prevent light ingress, they are like fully wrapped in blue foam. So again, there's no light. This will be relevant later. And you can see at the bottom here, these ones are labels. These are two completely independent reactors. This one here is our conductive reactor, and this one is our non-conductive reactor. So the reason we have that detailing is because, well, I'll explain how we achieved it first. So the fluidized media inside both of these is these little plastic beads. They are very little, lots of tubes, so we can get a good healthy biofilm on there. They're made of PVDF. The conductive ones are then treated with a semiconductive polyaniline coating. We did initially start with granular activated carbon, which is extremely porous and very, very conductive, but we found that operationally it was just a nightmare. So we switched to a semiconductor that was easier to operate. Now, the reason that we are looking into this is because of a metabolic phenomenon called direct interspecies electron transfer. Some of you might be familiar with the term, but to cover all bases, it's summarized very nicely here in this paper as a syntrophic metabolism where free electrons flow from one cell to another through shared physical and electrical connections without the requirement of reduced electron carriers like hydrogen and formate. Now, the benefit of this for the microbes is that rather than putting in the effort to attach an electron to a hydrogen, spit it out, another bacteria picks it up, takes the electron off of the hydrogen, they're rather able to just like hold hands and share electrons that way. And this is where the conductive media becomes interesting, because rather than having to like the microbes hold hands with each other, they can just share the electron directly into the media, which again, the hypothesis here, or this has been proven, it imparts a significant thermodynamic advantage because it takes a lot more effort to produce a molecule, send it out, and then another one pick it up. So this results in typically better performance. This is only really relevant as well in anaerobic environments because aerobic bacteria are already so prolific and they've got oxygen, which is more than happy to take your electrons. Thank you very much. So in anaerobic environments, this becomes very important. So there are two key elements that are really necessary for DIET to take place, and that is exoelectrogens, which are typically bacteria, and electrotrophs, which are typically methanogenic archaea. So this is COD removal data from our reactors upstairs in the lab. So you can see, other than a few like little bubbles, but consistently we've been between 70 to 92% COD removal, which for 6-hour HRT and anaerobic reactors is pretty impressive. So we're very, very happy with this. And we feel that this kind of, particularly again, where we've got our, interestingly, R2 is actually outperforming a little bit, but again, I'm a little bit behind on processing this data. I'm sure those results will flip over to more of what we're expecting. So now this is why, again, I mentioned the types of microbes. This is now published data from our collaborators in Korea and Hong Kong. All of these orange bars, these are all exoelectrogens. So again, like we've got one half of the DIET community that are coming through really nice and strong. I've got two here. So these Cryptonerbacter and Bacteroides, these are not confirmed exoelectrogens. However, given that they're very highly abundant on, we've got the GAC media here and the coated PVDF media here, they're very abundant here. So we are running with the hypothesis that there may be some DIET activity going on here. And then these blue ones are all syntrops, which prior to our understanding of DIET and still currently are very important for that metabolic process. So again, this is all kind of further fuel on the fire. DIET, yeah, we're happy, we're excited, it's happening. And the archaeal data further backs this up with methanolacto, which is, and methanobacterium, which is a big electrotrough, and lots of pathologens. So our data coming over from Korea when we started this was that, yes, you're going to get a lot of methane, you're going to get very good performance, and COD data backs this up. Great. So our gas, what we were expecting was something that looks a bit like this. So methane about 60%, carbon dioxide 35%, and a little bit of a few other things hanging around. What we got was this. So if you'll bear with me, I'll talk through this. I'll stay more on the steady state side for now, just to kind of explain. Our methane data, great, 50 to 60%, lovely. We're very happy, DIET, we're on. Where it started to go a little bit funny was this nitrogen data here. Now, in order to achieve an anaerobic environment, what we would initially do is purge with nitrogen gas to remove all of the oxygen, hence the really, really high nitrogen reading here. However, the fact that it's still there is now causing us to question, like, surely it would have moved on by now, okay? But it could be just hanging around, you never know. But then we have down here, this is carbon dioxide just hanging around at about 10%, where it should be about 35. So again, like the plot thickens, it's just getting stranger and stranger. And down at the bottom here, we have oxygen at about 0.5 to 2%. Okay, again, now we're thinking, is it leaking? Which is again, why I mentioned at the beginning, we promise it's not. It's definitely not leaking. Looking back now over at the initialization side, if you look at the nitrogen and the oxygen, nitrogen and carbon dioxide, sorry. Yeah, no, sorry, I've confused myself. The nitrogen and the oxygen, they almost perfectly follow each other, and the methane and the carbon dioxide follow each other, and they're almost perfectly mirrored. So we've now begun to consider that there are two distinct microbial communities going on here that initially were competing with each other and trying to establish dominance. They now reached steady state, but again, kind of further fuel on the fire. And this is the conductive reactor. We have a similar story in the non-conductive reactor, which if it was just one of them, we would think, okay, there's just something a little strange going on here, but it's both. So again, we're developing more and more questions as we go. So in order to kind of examine this and start thinking, well, what are we seeing here? We decided to look at the classical nitrogen cycle to see if that might explain some of our readings. So nitrification, denitrification is like your typical, this is what you will see in a lot of like industrial scale wastewater treatment plants. The trick with this one is that ordinarily you would have an aerobic process first to get that ammonium converted to nitrite, which could then be converted into nitrogen gas. We don't have that aerobic process, and our CO2 readings are very, very low. So, okay, fairly confident it's not this one. We've then got Anamox, which is 100% anaerobic, so okay, maybe a little bit closer. But again, it requires this nitrogen in order to, nitrate in order to focus, which theoretically we shouldn't have a lot of. So, okay, it's a little closer, but we're still not sure. a little bit of further research, I then came across this process called nitric oxide dismutase. This pathway utilizes an enzyme that splits nitric oxide, so NO, into its component elements of nitrogen gas and oxygen gas rather than nitrogen gas and carbon dioxide and or water. And this pathway has since been accepted, so this was initially published in 2012. It's since been accepted as one of 3 incredibly rare non-photosynthetic oxygen production mechanisms that are found in nature. So this was initially found in marine vents where they had some archaea that were producing their own oxygen that they could then use for other processes. So, okay, exciting. Now we might be onto something. As a sanity check, we thought, okay, if we are converting our ammonium to nitrogen gas in an anaerobic reactor, surely we would be seeing removal of that ammonium. And indeed we are. A very, very small amount, so 5%. So it's a small amount, but it's substantial. And again, it's both of them. So following on from this result, we got even more excited and we did a full mass balance. So from the 5% removal that we saw, this matches up pretty closely actually to the amount of gas we were seeing. And although the mass balance isn't completely balanced, so you can see here it's a negative, but ideally it should be 0, but it's in the same order of magnitude. So, okay, it's not perfect, but we're still missing this solid effluent, and this data here is based on 1 round of samples or 1 batch that contained maybe a handful of samples. So, yeah, again, we want to continue looking at this, but in order to do so, there are a couple of key questions that we need to answer. If nitric oxide dismutation is indeed taking place, as we are now starting to suspect it is, how is the initial nitrate formed? Because this is still the side of the equation that we need to address, of like, where is that initial bit of oxygen coming from before you can start this? And where does it go? If we were seeing nitric oxide dismutase, surely we would see equal volumes of nitrogen gas and oxygen gas. And then why is carbon dioxide so low? If we're getting all of this oxygen, surely then the methane generation will go down, carbon dioxide will go up. So where is the oxygen going? Why is it not going to carbon dioxide? We're currently looking at a hypothesis of some autotrophic species that may be using the carbon dioxide, and that's why that is so low and the oxygen is being consumed. And lastly, what is the relationship between methanogens, DIET, and nitric oxide dismutating species? As we saw in the initialization data, there was definitely some competition going on that seemed to then steady out. So how are they helping each other? Because they arrived at a peace. In terms of further research, so to investigate this further, and this is again where questions are more than welcomed after Pepe's presentation, we have metagenomic data, because this has been a big focus of our research, and we have a lot of the typical data as well as some idea of who we should be looking for. We will also be doing stable isotope probing. Thankfully, we have arranged a collaboration with Dr. Eijs Broadbent of Queen Mary University, so we will be doing batch reactors that are purged with nitrogen. So any nitrogen gas that we observe will definitely have been from our microbes. I would like to give a big thank you to Dr. Henry Lee, who is my primary supervisor, and Professor Stephen Smith. Our external collaborators, Amy Tan at the University of Hong Kong and Professor Jong Hwan Kim of the University of Inha, Korea. And a special thank you to Henry Kay, sat at the back there, from the University of Sao Paulo, who's been absolutely incredible, has brought all his experience of running these reactors to the lab. It's been brilliant. Thank you very much.
So I would like to invite the last speaker. So it's yours.
Thank you, Alex, for great presentations. So I'm Pepe Buchol, and I'm currently a research assistant at the Center for Systems Engineering and Innovation here at Imperial College London. And today I'm going to present some water-neutral solutions across different urban scales, which is part of my PhD that I just submitted a few weeks ago, and I'm expecting the viva by the end of July. And that was mainly supervised by Dr. Anna Mead and Professor Martin van Riewijk. And just to give you a disclaimer, this might provide a different perspective of the water management system compared to my 2 colleagues, because my background is in architecture and urban design. So first, I would like to start saying that, as you all know, our cities are composed by several infrastructure systems, such as transport, energy, water, or buildings, and they are all interconnected. So buildings are connected to water, to energy, transport is connected at the same time to all of them, and only with a systemic approach we could be able to understand how these complexities interact. But at the same time, they are also facing multiple pressures, such as population growth, climate emergency, like some episodes of droughts or flooding happening more often, for example, here in London, and then some social and economic pressures, like, for example, the housing crisis or the most recent cost of living crisis, for example. So for all these reasons together is why we thought that there is a strong need for an integrated urban planning approach, and that's when we came up with a city plan framework. So city plan is an infrastructure ecology framework based on the systemic design concept and always starts with a purpose. So this purpose could be either single or multiple, and the idea is to develop a series of urban planning scenarios. To evaluate these urban planning scenarios, we need some integrated evaluation tools that could give us some static or before-after dynamic evaluation, which will introduce a series of spatial GIS datasets that could come in a raw or in a process form, and also a series of design options. These design options could be either DTI, like Brooklyn infrastructure, or others. This will give us some metrics that will help us to have some decisions that could be either if, for example, this urban development is considered sustainable or not, or to have some spatial allocation inside the city. Towards what we call the systemic conditions for urban planning and design, and finally to have a more detailed design and modeling for our future cities. So coming back to this first slide where I said, okay, we have several infrastructure systems, we could have city plan transport, energy, buildings, or water. But to reduce that complexity and have more like a proof of concept of this framework, we decided to focus on water and with the purpose of water neutrality. In this case, we developed city plan water that has like 3 main clusters of areas of study. The first one being the systemic design purpose, as I said, being water neutrality. Second one, introducing a series of design options portfolio. And finally, water management integrated evaluation toolkit, where we have some modeling and spatial data analysis. These will all follow the planning system process from the UK and will have as main case study London. This will give us some tactical decisions or water neutrality targets. But what's exactly the water neutrality? So when we talk about that, how we understand this concept. So water neutrality always starts with some existing impact. That's what we call the baseline. And that's what we currently have in the city before making in any new urban development. Once we have new urban developments in the city, they could happen in 2 different ways. First could be in a business as usual scenario, which is like in a traditional way of construction and design, and that will have the biggest impact. But then we could also develop a series of water neutrality scenarios, implementing these water neutrality design options that I mentioned. So these water neutrality design options will offset the development impact, and in case we arrive to the threshold of the current baseline, is when we could consider that our development or our city is water neutral. So if we apply all of that to the 10-year housing target of the city scale in London, we decided to focus on 3 key urban indicators for urban water security. The first one is urban consumer demand in megaliters per day. The second one is urban flood risk for megaliters per day. And the third one is river water quality in phosphorus in milligrams per liter. And this will be the increase that we'll have in those 3 indicators once we have these more than 500,000 homes that London is expected to build during the next 10 years. So to fully offset these impacts at the city scale, we'll have to implement water neutrality options to new homes. We'll also have to retrofit some existing and add some plug-in space. But the question here is, but what are these numbers? So based on our WSI model that we developed also in our department, we did some simulations that I'm not going to go into detail, but at the city scale, and in order to achieve a water neutral London, we realized that we need to implement a series of water neutrality options, such as green roofs, rainwater recycling systems, rainwater harvesting, efficient appliances, impermeable pavers, etc., in all of them. But at the same time, we also need to retrofit almost the same amount of existing homes, which is around 432,000, and add an extra 19 square kilometers of BTI. That will be completely or almost what the minimum we need in order to achieve a water neutral London based on the previous concept. Obviously, adding 19 square kilometers of BTI doesn't mean to increase the area of the city, but to transform some parts of the city that currently are impervious or are brownfields or industrial sites and making them blue and green. But now the idea is, okay, we have these targets, we can call them water neutrality targets at a city scale, but what if we want to move those targets across scales? What if we want to have something at borough scale or even at urban development scale? So this work is part of two large research programs. One of them is called Camellia and the other one is called Ventura. And both of them share one case study in Enfield where local planning authorities are very keen to collaborate with us and want to introduce the water neutrality concept into their local plans. So that is when we move to Enfield, and especially south of the borough, they are currently planning and actually starting the phase one of one big development called Meridian Water, where in the next 20-25 years, they will have more than 10,000 new homes. And as you can see here, this is how is the current land of the site, which is mainly old industrial site or brownfield. And this is more or less the vision that they have for the place. And as you can see, there are already lots of water spaces, water bodies, because this is all these water reservoirs that we have in East London. So, okay, if we come back to city plan and the initial framework that I mentioned before, if we want to move these cross scales, is when we say how we could develop a framework or a tool that could combine this spatial GIS data with some design solutions, such as BTI or others. So then we developed what we call the Water Neutrality Decision Support Tool, or OneFDST, and it has two main parts. So first, it combines a series of data sets that are publicly available, such as, for example, population density, device efficiency, irrigation levels, land permeability, traffic density, and so on. All of them obviously connected to the urban planning purpose of urban water neutrality, as we said. But then we'll have also two ruling categories. So the first one is the urban planner's preference. So it's how or where the planners will like to have their new urban developments, or where they have a preference to place them. And the second, where we will have some retrofit opportunity to offset the impacts from those new developments. Once we combine these data sets with these two logic statements, is when we could assign a series of scores to each data set. And that came up with some participatory workshops that we did with them, as I said, with different kinds of stakeholders and all of them providing their feedback. In the end, on the third part of the DST, we'll first have one scoring map for each data set, but finally we'll have an aggregation map for each logic statement. So just to give you an idea how this might look like at a city scale, which is what we started having at the beginning, we'll have this is London, and this is the preference code. So the darker it is the red, the less preference they will have to place a new urban development in this specific location. And just to give you more or less some of the reasons why this might happen, obviously on the surroundings of the cities where we have the green belt and more natural spaces, so that's why they are trying to protect them. However, in the other one on the right, what we have is the aggregated water neutrality retrofit opportunity. And in this case, the darker it is, the more opportunity we have to retrofit and to offset the impacts from new developments. And here it happens more or less the opposite. So in the city center is where we have more aging infrastructure and more impermeable surfaces. So obviously what we could have is to offset from here to there with these two maps. But as I said, we knew more or less what we had at the city scale, but we want to focus, we want to have a more refined scale and definition. So then is when coming back to Enfield, we will have this, for example, urban planners preference scoring that we could combine with the results or targets that we obtained at a city scale. Then we have also the urban development, which was Meridian Water. And then we can implement a series of water neutrality design options with the systemic design concept that I mentioned at the beginning. So with the water systems integration model, which is WSI model that works with different integrated scales. We could check or simulate or evaluate or assess if the water neutrality targets are achieved inside the development boundaries or not. That will obviously be quite unlikely, but in case that happens, this will be the end of the process. So that means that this urban development can be considered water neutral without making anything outside. However, if it doesn't achieve the water neutrality inside the development boundaries, which is the most likely option, is when we go to the water neutrality retrofit opportunity scoring map and look for other places to offset that impact. So, and as we can see here with higher scores. So if we look at the targets that we have, I will just show you an example of how Meridian Water is at the moment. So that baseline, and as I said, this is the land uses that it has, mainly paved areas and developable brownfield lands. And these are the 3 targets that we are aiming to achieve. So it's 10,000 new homes. That is the equivalent of retrofitting almost the same number, so around 8,200 new existing homes, and at 336 squares of BTI. So if we look at the business as usual scenario, which is the proposed design, we will obviously don't have enough existing homes or BTI to achieve. So that's why we'll look at the map and see, okay, where inside our borough could find other places with higher score for retrofit opportunity and compensate this impact from the development. And this is more or less the map. And just to give you an idea of if this is the area of Meridian Water, which is around 100 hectares, all these orange squares that we can see here are existing homes that need to be retrofitted in order to this be water neutral. And all of this green space should be complemented with also this green space, blue-green space here, in order to again achieve water neutrality. So that's more or less from me today. As a conclusion, we had some water neutrality targets from our model that were at city scale. Then we wanted to translate that across scale, so we developed the water neutrality decision support tool. With the systemic design process, we moved these targets across different scales. And as a future work, which I think is what will be really interesting and important. Obviously, as you saw, this is mainly in a developed country and it's London. But ideally, we would like to implement these principles in other developing countries and also consider more water sanitation indicators, as we have seen here today. And finally, and something that we are already starting to develop, we would like to do a VDR, which is like a virtual decision room, where all decision makers could come and sit together and have some collaborative decision making towards those decisions. And especially with great potential to, in the end, or at some point, being applied to the other urban systems that I also mentioned at the beginning. So thank you so much.
Also, great speakers. Could you fun and join us? I guess you probably also enjoy very much like me. We found nano scale to micro scale and then into the citywide scale. So we're getting really different spectrums. Really enjoy. Is there any questions from the audiences? Yeah, please.
So yeah, really interesting that you see is a relevance of direct ammonium usage. I just want to know how you think you're going to prove it, right?
So yeah, this is very much the question that we have. So definitely these batch tests we are really excited about, especially if we can do purging with argon, because then it means with the stable isotope as well. So we're really grateful to Dr. Oscar, Queen Mary. So yeah, any nitrogen that we see hopefully will be from our bacteria, because we also suspect that it's a thing of other academics have probably seen something very similar, but they disregard it because like, oh, we purged with nitrogen, so it's not being generated. But now we're kind of thinking, maybe.
So if nitrogen is being generated, like what does it mean? How would the results be used, or what the implications be?
So, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the current mechanism for removal of nitrogen in industrialized wastewater treatment is you have an aerobic process and then an anaerobic process. Like at the very least, it's dual process, and as we know, aerobic is incredibly energy intensive. It chucks out CO2, so it's not great. If we could contain it to an anaerobic process, we get the biogas. You don't release loads of CO2, and yeah, I think it has a lot of potential. But first, we need to prove it, then we need to optimize it, and like many years in the future. But we think that would be a really big benefit if it worked. Yeah.
So I know. So does that mean you can have no nitrous oxide production? Because I believe that's a problem with biological treatment. Why it's not climate friendly.
So if the nitric oxide dismutase is what we're seeing, it would literally completely circumvent that issue because it splits it in half into nitrogen gas and oxygen gas. So yeah, that would be really cool.
Thank you all for your talks, super interesting. I've got a question for Alex. I might have missed it, but I don't know if you did your in situ measurements during a discharge event or not. But so this is, you get a sort of average contaminant concentration. How does it deal with peaks in concentration, for example?
Okay, so I did dig into this when I was writing up my thesis. Unfortunately, I could tell you how many hours a single overflow has discharged. I can't tell you when, based on publicly available data from the Environment Agency. The odds that a discharge event happened during my study was 7%. So it's hard to know if it happened. There are cases in the study where I believe a discharge event did happen but outside the water sample time. So the concentrations on passive sampler for the typical CSO markers such as the metabolite from cocaine, for example, is a marker of a CSO discharge, and venlafaxine and a lot of, and I think benzofibrate as well, benzofibrate, apologies, as well. So those concentrations were higher on our passive sampler during those months. So I believe that was September and October that they were higher. In terms of the passive sampler's response to a peak, because it is a time-weighted average, you do see a peak. So actually, can I just, yeah, am I allowed to flip back through? We could be here a while. Actually, you know what? Let's see if this is
back to now.
Yeah, let's do this back. Here we go. So on this graph here, I don't know if you can see it because of the thing. But anyway, so the circles and the squares are spot samples that were taken along the river. The dash lines are the online GCMS, so there's constantly measuring, and the solid lines are passive sampling done by chem capture. So you can see that the passive sample out in the water from the 17th of October to 24th of October does have a higher peak, which does correspond with the higher concentrations in the river. And there is a study by Ravel that does show it does respond to, if there is a sudden spike, the passive sample has got a fairly good response to it. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question in a roundy way.
Yeah, cool, thank you.
Okay.
Question to Emma. In what stage is the sensor? Is Emma the first speaker? In what stage is this device? Is it something which you can only play yourself, or you can, for example, somebody who has no experience take it and get some results of a heavily polluted river in country X, which has not any knowledge as you have?
Yeah, so we have published this device, the design of this device is published, STL files are available online, so anyone with a 3D printer can print one off, and you just have to acquire the PEZ membrane and the sorbents, punch it out, and throw it in your local river. We also ran a citizen science project with these devices where we trained canoeists, kayakers, fishers, just members of the public to put these out, and they were successfully able to deploy them, retrieve them, and then send them back to us for analysis.
So that's back to you, I mean, if it is in Zambia or wherever, or
It will need
send
to,
it back to you here.
if you send back to me here, or it can be sent back to an analytical lab in their country. So the extraction procedure is free, it's been published in an open source journal, anyone can access it, anyone can do the
So
process.
it is actually readily available.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, I'll speak to you.
yeah.
Let's need another 3 years of disaster prototyping now.
Fair enough.
I've got a question for Pepe on the retrofitting the water neutral technologies. You spoke about stakeholders.
was there any point in your research where you spoke to landlords of existing properties about whether they are eager to have these retrofitting in their existing properties?
Yeah.
Did you speak about the cost and the benefits and all the other interrelated aspects of it?
Okay, I think the question has like two sides. So thank you so much. It's a very interesting question. So first of all, we didn't have homeowners as part of our stakeholders, but we had developers, we had local parent authorities, we had water companies, environment agency, GLA. So it was more like in the policy making and the actual developing company side. But here comes the interesting side, which connects with your second part, and it's like they are not aiming to make the homeowners come up with the resources or with the budget to retrofit the houses. The developers themselves will need to provide that money as an exchange of the planning permission. So if they want to be water neutral, they will have to provide the fee that they had already before, plus certain costs that could be either managed by them, so they could be the ones in charge of improving that area of the borough, or they could give that money to the local authority, like local council, and the council will be in charge of giving the strategies to improve both the urban spaces and the private houses. So it's that idea, like, because there is like a levy that they are trying to implement as any other, where in order to get planning permission, they need to give that money, which is quite interesting. So,
So I'll give it to the lady.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pepe. Quite interesting. I also wanted to ask you about, if you could expand a little bit about the phosphorus removal you were talking about in the slide, and what stage it is currently at right now?
Yes, so the phosphorus is in milligrams per liter, and it's the measure that we have in the river Thames.
Yeah.
So that's what the model has. So it's like how are the measurements at the moment, and how with the wastewater that these new developments will produce will increase this these milligrams per liter. So I think it was as you see here, it was like 10-12% increase compared to current levels. And obviously, if we have some water recycling systems, or we have any other type of way of reducing the wastewater going into the wastewater treatment plants, this will avoid the increase into the levels of the river. So that's how the offset happens.
Thank you.
I have a question for all three speakers. So I think maybe if I can ask all my questions now, if that's okay. Well, first of all, really, great thoughts from all of you. For Alex, have you tried non-targeted analysis with your samplers?
Yes, yes, in November, time's meaningless soup when you're writing a thesis. Yeah, so in November of, basically, I've run 4 months worth of data on a non-target approach using the water, the 3 different types of past samplers and the Gamma's data. I have not crunched that in data because that was gigabytes of data, but we do have the data, and I will get to it eventually. But we have run them also through a suspect screening process as well, particularly for the Gamma's and the water. So watch this space.
It's okay. Yeah, and Emma, just to confirm, there's no nitrate at all in the influent.
There's no not that we're aware of, there's no nitrate in the influent, so we include an ammonium chloride. Whether that goes through some degradation before it gets into them, potentially, but certainly not at the kind of concentrations that we would expect would produce that amount of nitrogen gas.
And then finally, forgive me, for Pepe, how do you validate the results of the model? Do you have data that kind of sort of gives you a check on, okay, this model is giving us answers that are, accurate, if you will?
Yeah, so this water system integration model, it's using a historical data, which introduces obviously some climate data, and as we were saying, other indicators that we have, and that's been checked. So that's not been developed by me. So I haven't developed the model. I just used it to do the simulations. But obviously that's have been cross-checked and had all the accuracy assessments.
Yeah, first of all, thanks to all of you, that was great. My question is to Pepe. Just to follow one question on like kind of that trading mechanism at the borrower level, that the development could be retrofitted to counteract a new development. Do you see that kind of mechanism happening throughout London in future, or will it stay at the borrower level? I guess that.
So that's the intention. So as you saw, the first maps were at the city scale, but obviously that's too complex.
Yeah.
So then that is when we try to break down let's say the problem into parts, and actually is where local planning authorities operate. So they operate more at borough scale than a whole London system level. So, but still TLA is the one who is trying to put new policies in order to make them be, for example, water neutral. But that's decision from each borough. So each council decides if they want to become water neutral and they want to put it as part of the local plan or not, even if the general London plan, the last one happened in 2021, just gives some indications, right? The final decision is from them, and they are the ones also in charge of controlling the developers and saying where and how they provide this planning permission. And that connects with the previous question. So there is one new policy called Section 106.
Yeah.
So if someone wants to look at it, it's exactly that. So it's how developers should provide extra funding in order to be more sustainable, more, in this case, water neutral, or any other sustainability indicator that planning authorities want to have. So,
and you always have to hit those three indicators at the same time. Yeah, you have to target them. You can't just do more retrofitting to compensate for blue and green. Or
yeah, we discussed that. So, I mean, generally in the literature, they look at water neutrality just from consumer demands.
Yeah.
But we thought that that was too reduced, and urban water security is actually more than that, and especially because urban developments have a lot of impervious areas, so that increases hugely the flood risk, as we saw in those graphs. So that's why we looked at the three indicators. So all these numbers that we had are based on the three of them. So it's being water neutral in all of them. However, if you just look at one of them specifically, you might have different numbers. So in our paper, we have different scenarios, and each scenario focuses on one or the other. For example, if you only want to be water neutral for flood risk, perhaps you only need more blue-green spaces, and you don't need more, I don't know, water harvesting, or water harvesting perhaps, yes, but or water efficiency or so on. So depending on which one you want to focus, you could, because maybe it could be the case that one borough has a bigger issue on flooding, while another has another issue on water demand because they have some scarcity of water. If that's the case, then is when they could look only at one indicator. But otherwise, it's holistic.
Thanks.
I think you might have just answered this question, but it's kind of linked. I guess would you also be looking at overlaying like kind of political economy analysis on top of that to work out where you could intervene? I was just thinking, with like SUDS has been part of planning paradigms for decades now, but you still have a super sewer. So there are so many barriers towards getting to be water neutral. So would that be like part of your decision making process?
Yeah, so you mean the Thames Tideway? Yeah. So Thames Tideway is a bit controversial. So, and yeah, obviously they argue that would reduce a lot the flood in London, especially for some CSO episodes and so on. But we believe that, especially for some located issues in some other parts of the city, it would be much better to go towards nature-based kind of solutions, right? Like where we try to be more permeable as an overall instead of having just a big pie where everything goes, because in the end it's just copying what we had, right? And bringing it up to the political side is just obviously making them understand that this could work as well and give them numbers. So that's what I think our work does. Like before they say, yeah, it's good to have green roofs, it's good to have, but what exactly, how much, how many do we, if we are making this X amount of houses. So that's exactly what you need to make policymakers, or in this case, politicians, understand. It's like, if you want to offset this huge amount of houses that you want to do, and you don't want to increase the flooding in the city, you have to compensate it with all of that in other parts of the city that currently are, some of them are just abandoned areas, like are covered by concrete. So why don't, you need to transform that at least,
So it's like an influencing tool as well as a.
It's an, the idea, as I said, once we have the virtual, this VDR, virtual decision group, that will be like a web-based in interface where they could play around, so they could put maybe 5,000 comes here. Okay, then you have to do this, and very visually and user-friendly way, they could understand what to do. So it's,
Thank you.
Sorry, Pepe, sorry, thank you so much for presenting. Sorry, you might have mentioned about it. I was late for the presentation. I know that you had this city what with Camila before. How this WhatNet DST that you said, how this is, what's the relationship between these two software? Is it somehow the same, or is it something below the top of that?
No, so WSI mods is the same as City Watts, but it's just that they work at, so City Watt was the first version of the model.
Okay.
And that was a lumped model. So it was aggregating everything in the whole city and the Thames.
Okay.
But now we have WSI mod, who has different, let's say, refined scales. Now it's semi-distributed wastewater zones, and also now it's a sub-catchment zones. So it's going smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
So that's WSI mod. But then the WaSH DST is a completely different concept. So it's just a decision support tool that combines data sets with a series of, as I said, logic statements that come from this participatory.
Okay. It doesn't do any simulation or something.
No, but as part of the next stage of the work, we would like to connect and see, okay, so WaSH DST is saying something, and this is what is saying the model. At the moment, what we do is just checking or helping. So it's like one gives the targets, the other one gives the spatial distribution,
Sure.
let's say. And now we will be ideally to
See how that works.
double check and come back to the model somehow. So it's like a close the loop.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Questions?
It's a complex question, but thanks all for great talk. I don't know if I can ask a question, because I haven't cleared in my head, but as you were talking, my thought was that I wonder to what extent this is really local parameters dependent, and how much can you actually apply the same type of study anywhere else in terms of citizen, to what extent does it depend on who owns the infrastructure and whether it's public or it's not, and all that. And then you had that last slide where you said you want to extend this to countries where there's no. And that's even more complex in my mind, but I'm not an expert. So I was going to ask you, how easy do you think that is? Does it require complete redesign of the model? I guess the type of infrastructure is completely different.
What could be complexity? So obviously the lack of data is always the first, we all know, right? So in these countries, we might encounter that we don't have any data to even introduce it to the model. Right. So that would be the first challenge. So how we get targets if we actually don't know how actually to simulate it. And then the second one, which is how to, I guess, deal with the stakeholders. Obviously, if we just separate it to developed countries, might be similar. But as far as we go to other ones, it might be very, very challenging, because perhaps they operate differently. Water companies might be part of government, developers as well. So yeah, it's a big challenge, and we still have.
But from a technical perspective, it's mostly just the existence of data.
I think so. Yeah. So as soon as we had the data sets, should work. But then obviously we'll find the other challenges, which are more operational.
Question to Pepe. So how do you think to deal with in the future with this imbalanced power of politicians and the grassroots? We know that the controversial Thames Tideway, which even the guys who designed it gave up this idea, but Boris Johnson, when he was mayor, pushed for it. So it's easier to burn this money in one place than to go around all these places, do this HVAC service.
That shows the power of the politicians. So they are the ones who, even not knowing anything about
But this is a developed country.
engineering, they decide
it
to
should be done and not how the thing should be done. All the academic professionals were strongly against it. We wrote a petition. No way. They made it happen. Instead of going to this decentralized nation.
exactly.
And they said, well, who will deal with this 30 whatever number of local governments? This is much easier. So how do you think
It's a very good reflection.
how this concept of making it happen in a logical way, everybody sees it, that is much better way to go, rather than burn your money on single system, which even Brexit, they pushed for Brexit, they said they are building it to meet European standards, not be penalized by European Union because we are politicians.
Yeah, and then it was completely. It's a very good reflection. I would say, from my experience, that the best way will be to go cross scales, but inside the operational side. So it's like first approach the small local departments, as we try to do. Like first see if local Beirn authorities from councils are keen to go with these ideas, but then also collaborate with GLA. So it's like all the spectrum, because otherwise if you try to do a top bottom, it would be wrong. If you do the other one with where you only engage citizens, politicians like Boris could say, no, that's not, you know what I mean? So you could always find the clash. But if you go from both sides, perhaps that might be effective, but difficult. So it's the same as going to developing countries. So very, very challenging, but perhaps the more involvement with more different type of organizations, the more success you could have, hopefully.
We have the question from the oh, that's fine. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah.
I guess I had a question and it relates to all of this, is that kind of why did you pick London? Because it's probably the hardest to tackle. Would your approach have worked better, or would it be more applicable to a smaller town, a new development where you've got a much more cohesive local government body, you've got people who probably sit in dialogue with each other on a regular basis? So I was thinking during the presentation and subsequently, it's like you picked probably the most challenging. And what was the reason for that?
So the reason is very easy to understand, practical and honest, is because the funding was focused just on London. So Camellia project is community water for a livable London. And that was the case study. And obviously when I did my research proposal for PhD, I was looking even at 4 different countries in the 40 degrees latitude, but the funding came for London. So for now, that's the focus, that's where we have been developing these. Ideally, we would like to move to either, as you said, regional scale or smaller towns or other places in the world. But for now, PhD was there. So.
I guess it's about the time, and we will thank you for your participants for all the good questions, and thank you for 3 speakers, and also we have our coordinator like India, Elizabeth, and that really get a really good this kind of a setup. So that's all for this main section.